This podcast is made possible through listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. And the Florence County Museum, presenting Kindred Spirit, the personal worlds of William H. Johnson, exploring the painter's artistic evolution and journey of self-discovery from rural South Carolina to Europe and New York. flocomuseum.org. And Meadow Garden, home of George Walton, one of the youngest signers of the Declaration of Independence. Open for tours Monday through Friday, 10 to 4. Learn more at historicmeadowgarden.org and visit augusta.com.
From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, welcoming you to our podcast series about South Carolina culture and history with a nod to all things Southern. Today, Alfred Turner and I will be talking with Alan Pell Crawford about his book, This Fierce People, the Untold Story of America's Revolutionary War in the South.
The famous battles that formed the backbone of the story put forth of American independence at Lexington and Concord, Brandywine, Germantown, Saratoga, and Monmouth, while crucial, did not lead to the surrender at Yorktown. It was in the 3+ years between Monmouth and Yorktown that the war was won.
In This Fierce People, Alan Crawford tells the story of those 3+ years in the American Revolution. And it was in the fierce battles fought during this time in the South that the British were indeed defeated. Alan, welcome to the show. Before we get started on your book, This Fierce People, the Untold Story of America's Revolutionary War in the South, let's talk a little bit about you. You know, in South Carolina and down south, who are you and who are your people and how did you get to where you are now?
My people are obscure origins, the best I can tell. They seem to have come from Virginia into Kentucky and then crossed the Ohio into southern Illinois and southern Indiana. So I have no legitimate claims to the Carolinas and the most meager to Virginia. But I spent most of my career in Washington, D.C., and then moved to Richmond I'm so used to this, I started to say 1793.
It happened.
Aging me more than I would like to imagine. So in 1993, we moved to Richmond and have been here ever since.
Alan, what did you do in Washington?
I was a journalist and congressional staffer, and so I worked on the U.S. Senate and I worked in Congress, and then I was mainly a freelance writer and journalist.
So what brought you to history? I mean, you've done books on Jefferson, you have a fallen young woman in the colonial period. What brought you into history?
I can remember as a child reading a book on Gettysburg, and I believe it was by McKinley Cantor.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember being absolutely enthralled with the prose. There were moments in it that gripped me in some strange way. And between that and living on a small farm where every day I would go down to the pond and pretend I was Huckleberry Finn. And I can remember my mother telling me that I was always making rafts. And my father looked out the back window once and he said, "Well, there's Alan throwing more lumber into the pond." So I was always fascinated both by the past and then trying to conjure it up in some mysterious way.
Well, as I mentioned, you've done 2 books. You did a book on Jefferson about his last years, and then I love the title of your other book, Unwise Passion, a true story of a remarkable woman and the first great scandal of 18th century America. A bodice ripper?
Yeah.
Well, I think from your first book, you found out that colonial Americans it wasn't history behind a picket fence. They were very normal human beings with all sorts of foibles as well as heroism. So let's move now to your book on the Revolution, and why did you take up that particular topic?
I got very interested in George Washington at one point. And in fact, I did fellowships at both Monticello, at the research center there, and at Mount Vernon. As the more I learned about George Washington, there was some question that kept coming up in my mind about the American Revolution, because I had learned the standard history that all of us are taught, unless you actively seek out a broader understanding of the war, that there's the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre and Lexington and Concord, and then George Washington crosses the Delaware. They go to Valley Forge, and then they leave Valley Forge, and then the British surrender at Yorktown.
This sounds familiar. Sorry.
Yeah, I would throw in Saratoga, and then Yorktown. And having reviewed American history texts over the last 40 or 50 years, that's pretty much the story. The war in the South is either completely neglected or it is dismissed. In fact, some early 21st century historians said that Kings Mountain and Cowpens weren't particularly important in the story of the American Revolution. And in your introduction, you talk about why we don't know much about or have not been taught much about the American Revolution in the South. And I think we need to address that for a few minutes. So I'll turn it over to you.
Well, I think that part of it is, of course, has to be somewhat speculation on that question. A number of things. The one, of course, that's less controversial, I suppose, is that we view the revolution in George Washington's shadow, the shadow of his presidency and greatness and all of that, which I stipulate. And that's part of it. Another part, it seems to me that the early histories of the war, and you are a specialist on this stuff, I think. I'm a newcomer and a scout in a sense, but it seems to me that the earliest histories of the war are in fact biographies of Washington, or at least that's what the public gets. One good book on the subject is called George Washington's War. So it sees the entire war in the shadow of Washington. And so the histories are written as biographies early on, and the others are written by people from Massachusetts and New York.
That's true. And of course, when you talk about the war through Washington, after 1778 until Yorktown, he didn't really participate in any major military action. But your story about historians, particularly from Massachusetts, is right on. I'm just going to read a short quotation from George Bancroft from his first, he wrote the first great American history, and it came out prior to 1860. And he said, South Carolina moved onward to independence through the bitterest afflictions of Civil War. Left mainly to her own resources, it was through bloodshed and devastation and the depths of wretchedness that her citizens were to bring her back to her place in the Republic by their own heroic courage and self-devotion, having suffered more and dared more and achieved more than the men of any other state. The second printing occurred after 1860. That paragraph is not in there.
Is that right? That is so telling, isn't it? That's so remarkable. I was not aware, as I say, I'm not a specialist, and I don't, there's tremendous amounts of stuff that I don't know and that I'm still learning. But that says so much.
Well, and also during the debates over slavery in the 1840s and 1850s, senators from one side and the other were making assertions, casting aspersions, and usually it was abolitionist senators saying, well, what did you boys down south do before, y'all didn't have any part in the story. And of course, as you point out very neatly, I might add, is that the question of slavery hangs over this whole question.
Sure, and the question of whether or not Southerners are loyal Americans, I think figures into this. Backing up just a second, I would see books that not only told the history as we just described it, from like the Boston Massacre to Saratoga. I've seen them that will have at the back end, almost as an afterthought, it will say it will have one chapter on the war in the South. Mm-hmm. And what Bancroft says there is, at least in the early edition, is beautifully said, and I think dramatically conveys the war in the South that began to fascinate me, that made me want to understand this whole story better. Before we dismiss George Washington from the ranks, I think that what I realized, and there's one letter he writes to Nathaniel Greene shortly after Greene is appointed head of the Southern Department. He says, in effect, I really don't know what's going on down there. I don't know the disposition of the enemy. I don't really understand the topography. I don't know our own troop strength. You've got to figure this all out. And Washington begins the war with a letter to Patrick Henry, I believe it is, saying the kind of men we need for officers are men of reputation and breeding, basically, and good families, gentlemen who have a reputation at stake, and the independent judgment and all of that. And these are the kind of men we need to be running this war.
Well,
that's how he begins the war. But
yeah.
by a couple of years into it, he's turning to Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan and some of these who are very much self-made men, and delegating authority to them. And I think Washington's role in the South is remarkable because he knows what he doesn't know, and he is such a good judge of character and ability that he can appoint these people and give them the authority they need to do what they need to get the job done. And so I didn't come away thinking less of George Washington, but in an interesting way thinking more of him for attributes of character that he, in a sense, has not gotten quite the credit he deserves, because we always think of Benedict Arnold.
Well, and let's not forget the politicians. I really like the way you get into, before the first battle at Camden, when Gates is coming south, and then you have a chapter and you go into Gates, who has always been one of my anti-heroes. I love to whip up on Granny Gates or Galloper Gates or whatever you want to call him. After the fall of Charleston, which Washington knew was going to be a calamity, but he also understood that if Charleston fell, the British were going to move the fighting south, which is, of course, Clinton's great plan: roll up the South, take it, and we'll have peace, and, New England can go whichever way they want to go. But after Charleston fell, General Benjamin Lincoln, of course, couldn't keep command. He'd surrendered. He'd been paroled. So Washington wants to send Greene down, but Congress sends Horatio Gates. And I'll just let you riff a little bit on Horatio Gates, if you don't mind.
Well, I think there's some bad feeling between Washington and Gates. And so when Gates is sent to the South, over, as you say, Washington's better judgment, he makes a mess of things and paves the way for Greene's appointment. I don't know enough to say much more about Gates than that Washington's original assessment of him seems to have been correct.
Well, you did a very nice job in your book pointing out very gently that when the battle at Camden began to go awry, he jumped on his horse and didn't stop till he had passed Charlotte, where he changed horses. But anyway, Gates is gone from the scene. You've had Charleston surrender, most of South Carolina under British occupation, a very cruel occupation, as you point out. And they've got to try to rebuild the army in the South. And that's one thing you do beautifully, by the way, explain the difference between Continentals and the partisans, as I like to call it, the men. They were not really just militia. They were organized bands that came together as when the enemy's in the neighborhood, whether it's with Francis Marian or it's with Andrew Pickens or with Thomas Sumter or literally several dozen other local military leaders. They began a partisan war, a guerrilla war that certainly took its toll, but there needs to be a regular army presence. And so Washington gives Nathaniel Greene the mission. You go down there with a few troops, and yeah, you're understaffed, but you got to take this matter in hand. And Greene does.
Yeah, and the fact that you like these passages is great, makes me feel great, because Partisans and Redcoats is an awfully good book that gives such a great sense of these skirmishes and battles and Williamson's and Huck's defeat and all of that, in which, and by the way, as a challenge as a writer who's writing not for military history buffs or for academics, but for the general reader, is precisely the nature of these groups of men, partisans and guerrillas and militia and regulars, et cetera, coming together. And I have a cousin who's a Civil War historian in Lexington, Kentucky. And I was talking to him about this once, and I said, I can't keep all these divisions straight. I said, you got the 49th Carolina, whatever, and then you've got the Continentals, and you've got militia, and you've got Marian, and all these people maybe fighting in the same place at the same time. And I said, these numbers of the divisions and all of that won't mean anything to the general reader. And I can't keep them straight. And he said, it's just kind of a big mixing bowl. Don't even try. And a word that I don't think I use in the book, and avoided it, and I avoid it in general discussions of this stuff because I think it might be anachronistic, and that is the term patriots. And Walter, I'd be eager for your thoughts on that, because if anything, the advocates of independence would call themselves Whigs fighting Tories. And the term patriots seems to be affixed later. And I find I was uncomfortable with it. Do you have thoughts on that?
As you know, in my book, I prefer to use the term partisans. In some letters and diaries, and a couple of the colonial newspapers, you do see the term patriot, but it's not used all that much. I think you're right. I think it's a post-revolutionary phenomenon. As the birth of American nation, as we began to create heroes using Whig and Tory, which they did use, the folks we're talking about did talk about they were Whigs as opposed to the Tories. They didn't particularly like to use the term loyalist, which is what we now call those who stood up for the king. But you've got that burst of patriotic literature. You mentioned Parson Weems' biography of Washington. He also did one of Francis Marian. The New England poets created all of these American heroes, and part of creating, I think, a new American identity in the 25 years, the generation after the American Revolution, you see the term patriots.
Also, I think we think the term patriot, and maybe it does, it means you love your country. Well, there really isn't a nation to love during the Revolution.
There was no America. People were fighting for hearth and home. They identified themselves as South Carolinians or Virginians. it took a while before they identified themselves as Americans. And as you well know, there are probably 10 or 12 feet of bookshelf space devoted to this idea of American identity and how it came about.
I think that the over mountain men is a fascinating phenomenon, because I would be eager to know how they saw themselves in this context. That part of the country, it was Kentucky and Tennessee as we know it today. So who would they, when they come across the mountains to fight Ferguson at Kings Mountain, I'm wondering what their self-identity would have been.
They were there because Ferguson ticked them off. He threatened them. And of course, with all due respect to the over the mountain men, they were only part of the group at Kings Mountain. There were militia from Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia, all of who participated in that battle. And the myth of the over mountain men, I don't want to disparage what they did, but it weren't just them who made the difference. I mean, the Battle of Kings Mountain is incredible. I've walked that battle site any number of times, and I get to the top and I look at the hard stone and think, how on earth did Ferguson decide he was going to come here and, quote, dig in? You couldn't dig in. I mean,
I am good. I've been there myself twice, and I had that same feeling. I also don't understand how the British thought that they could establish a fort at Fort Watson that would be impregnable, because they're on top of an Indian burial ground. It is remarkable to me that they would take a position similar to what, in a much smaller way, to what Ferguson did at Kings Mountain, and think that was a secure location. Can you help me on that?
Let's look at background. What is the English countryside dotted with? Abandoned castles and so forth that were built on high ground as strong points. In many ways, the British were doing in occupied South Carolina what the American Army did in Vietnam. They were having fortified villages, and it was fine during the day, but the enemy owned the night. In fact, there have been some books comparing the warfare in South Carolina and the Revolution with the American conduct of the war in Vietnam.
And I got to say, since we mentioned Fort Watson, let's remind people where and when that was.
Okay. To you, Alan.
That would have been mid-April of 1781, when Marian and Lee have been dispatched after Cowpens and the race to the Dan to conduct what is called the War of Posts. So they're trying to knock off British depots and forts that kind of, as I understood it, connected Charleston to the backcountry.
Especially to 96.
Yes.
96 is the main point, but you've also got Camden, which is still an occupied strong point.
And geographically, Fort Watson was where?
Fort Watson on the Congaree River.
Okay.
Yeah. Fort Mott is fascinating, too, because that's, a couple of weeks later. Mm-hmm. And that is and there's some great mythology in some of these episodes, and I guess people will argue about them indefinitely, but the British have taken the Mott family plantation and driven Mrs. Mott and the rest of the household into some cabins on the property, I believe, and taken over her mansion and established a defensive position there. And Lee and Marian show up, and they can't figure out how they're going to take this, but they figure they can fire arrows into the mansion and drive the British out. So Marian, of course, is a rough character, and Lee is a gentleman with a background in high society of Virginia. And he is delegated to go tell Mrs. Mott what they plan to do, which is burn her house down. And she apparently rises to the occasion and says, I have these arrows. I think they're from India, supposedly. And here, you use them. Be my guest. And they fire some arrows into the attic or the roof of the house, and the British panic and give up and surrender the house, and everybody lives happily ever after. But it's another great moment in the campaign that leads to then Granby and Grierson, and these posts, as they're called, begin to, one by one they fall.
To add to the story of Fort Mott, yes, the house could catch on fire because all of the houses had wooden shingle roofs, which had dried out in the South Carolina sun. So, yes, they were susceptible to that. But at Fort Watson, and I want to get back to that forgotten battle, is the Americans came up with a medieval siege tower to capture Fort Watson.
Wow.
Yeah, and so apparently they go around the neighborhood and get axes and building materials of one sort or another. And I think one member of the army is a engineer of some kind, and he comes to Marian and Lee and says, hey, I can build this siege tower. And they roll it up in the night, and the commander at Fort Watson wakes up in the morning and sees this tower, which looks down on his own fort, and they can fire into the fort. And it's something out of the 15th century.
Yeah, I mean, yes, because the problem was there was too much open terrain around Fort Watson. It was well sited in that respect. So what they did is they built this tower, and the top, it was like a blockhouse, so that the soldiers could fire down over the parapet around Fort Watson, but they were protected behind the logs. I mean, it really was a medieval siege tower.
You know, if they'd been a little more desperate, they would have come up with a Trojan horse.
Well, in our conversation, Alan, what we're talking about Marian and Lee working together. One of the things Greene did in the last 2 years of the war in South Carolina is you had regular Army units paired up with partisans. That's how the war was conducted. Utah Springs, all the other engagements until Charleston surrendered.
Yeah, and I think that I can't remember if it's Otto Holland Williams, who when Marian first shows up with his troops, Williams says it was all they could do to restrain their laughter, because this is such a woebegone group of men that seem so unsoldier-like. And that's when I think Greene says, in a way that can be interpreted as kind of condescending almost, as well, you go harass the enemy wherever you want, just kind of stay out of my way. And I think over time they come to realize how valuable Marian is. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's fair. Also, if we go back to Gates before his disaster at Camden, Marian's men had showed up there. Gates didn't pay any attention to Marian. He did pay attention to Thomas Sumter, who, liked to strut around and what have you, and had Gates listened to Marian about the route that Gates was proposing to take to Camden, he might have had a different outcome, because Gates marched through countryside that had been denuded of any kind of substance, and so the troops were eating green corn and molasses, which is also a natural purgative, and so the boys were having to drop trowel all the way to Camden, and were in pretty sad shape for that first battle. But back to Marian's men. Marian's band, it included, in terms of the white population, from wealthy planters to lots of yeoman farmers, Catawba Indians, persons of color, both free and enslaved, who were not cooks, they were soldiers. Not that Marian was necessarily any great liberal, but if somebody was going to fight, he let them fight.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And I think Greene at one point late in the war was arguing that they should have allowed more people of color into the ranks. And one of the Southern legislators, I believe, said, well, this is just one of those characters from Rhode Island that really wants these people freed.
And of course, one of the issues was that the Southern states were not meeting their quotas to supply troops to the Continental Army. I'm speaking here of Virginia and the two Carolinas. John Laurens, who was an aide-de-camp to George Washington, son of one of the largest slave traders in the colonies, his father, Henry Laurens, former president of the Continental Congress, Laurens proposed arming slaves to fight the British. It didn't get anywhere. He actually brought it to the floor of the South Carolina General Assembly, and you've already quoted the comment, that this is a back door to free everybody. But at the other major battles in South Carolina, at Kings Mountain and at Cowpens, there were black soldiers. The late Bobby Moss has done several books on the fighters at both Kings Mountain and Cowpens, and identified those who were persons of color who participated.
I hate to say this, gentlemen, but we need to sort of begin to wrap our conversation up, and toward that end, I want us to go ahead and take the battles in the South toward their conclusion, sending those British forces up north to finally surrender. But I got a question about the title of this book, This Fierce People. It sounds like a quote. Is this a quote?
Yes, it's from Burke's speech on conciliation with the colonies. It's fascinating because he's warning other members of Parliament that this is not going to be a pushover because these, and he uses the term, this fierce people, in them the blood of freedom circulates because they're English. And Burke also argues, and I thought this was absolutely fascinating, that the appetite for independence in the South was stronger than in the North, precisely because of the presence of slavery. He seems to be suggesting that in Massachusetts, for example, freedom and liberty are kind of an abstraction. But in the South, that's a present, concrete, day-to-day reality because of the existence of slavery. And this rhetoric appears frequently in the propaganda, the arguments of what we would now call the patriots, because they say the British are trying to enslave us. Yes. And we have to fight against slavery. So there's a wonderful irony in all of it. But I think Burke is probably right about that, and he's right about so much much else.
And let's identify for our listeners who Burke is.
Edmund Burke is the British Whig parliamentarian, author, best known for his reflections on the revolution in France, which is maybe the greatest early philosophical explanation of what we consider conservatism.
Okay. All right. In response to Alfred's question, let's do Cowpens because that is an incredible battle in its own right. Greene does something that no commander is supposed to do. He's facing an army that's larger than his under Lord Cornwallis, yet he divides his army and sends part of it away, hoping that Cornwallis will divide his forces, which he does. And he sends the big bad guy of the revolution, Banastre Tarleton, commanding the forces that go after Daniel Morgan and the part of the army that Greene has sent upstate. And they meet at the Battle of Cowpens. And I'll let you go from there, Alan.
What's fascinating about that is that Morgan himself, who is another kind of partisan by instinct and experience, understands the what untested, untrained soldiers are likely to do, which is when the British charge with the send a volley into the or into the troops, and then charges with the bayonet, that a lot of them are going to run. He understands this, and before the battle, he goes from campfire to campfire, telling these untested soldiers, all we want you to do is fire once or twice, and then you can leave the battlefield. And I think he says how the old folks will cheer you and the girls will kiss you for your gallant conduct. And he's using them in a way that will turn that weakness into a strength. So he divides his army that will face Tarleton into 3 lines, I believe. And the first is the one with the most untested troops. They are to fire and then skedaddle off the field, which when the British come on, they do. They fire and then they run away, and Morgan hopes that the British interpret this as a rout, which it seems that they might have done. So then they come charging forward, not knowing there's a second line of more tested troops that they're going to run right into. The thing that doesn't work out as neatly as anybody ever hopes, but it's a brilliant tactic. And so Tarleton misinterprets this. His men charge on, and they get cut pretty badly, and Morgan wins the Battle of Cowpens.
Of course, then Morgan joins back up with Greene. There's the race to the Dan River in Virginia, where they hope if they can get across the Dan, then they can get food, ammunition, and they outrun Cornwallis, and then Greene turns the table. His troops, once they've gotten the food, ammunition, they turn around, they chase Cornwallis. They have the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. But by the time Cornwallis has gone through Guilford Courthouse and a few other skirmishes, his army is virtually destroyed, demoralized.
And I also like the fact that I think the first troops to cross back over the Dan into North Carolina, it was a very eager Light Horse Harry Lee that wanted to get back in the battles. Mm-hmm. And so over time, the British will to keep fighting this war when they've got. We also forget that this was a global. The British were involved in India and the Caribbean and other places during this time, and so the war in the colonies is only one aspect of what they're trying to do. But this, as you say, by this point, the troops are pretty much it's more and more difficult to supply them. They're getting defeated, as some parliamentarian, I believe, said, by damn driblets. Not even things that qualified it as actual battles.
Well, Alfred's giving me the wind-up sign, Alan, but I want to just quote a few statistics which will underscore your argument and mine about the importance of the war in the South. And these figures that I'm going to be talking about come from the official records of the United States Army. In 1780, 1,000 Americans were killed in action. 2/3 of those died in South Carolina. Of the 2,000 men who were wounded in uniform in that year, 90% were wounded in South Carolina. In the last 2 years of fighting the Revolution, 1,089 men died in South Carolina. That's 18% of all men in uniform killed during the entire Revolutionary War. And of the 2,400 wounded, 31% were wounded in South Carolina. Now, those figures don't include men who were not on the rolls, and as you point out, there were constant neighborhood brawls. It was a civil war. If somebody wasn't on a roll, he wasn't counted as a casualty. But that could be covered by a comment that was made. Someone was visiting in Charleston, a Frenchman, who commented on the number of widows wearing black. And his friend said, in District 96, where the Star Fort was, there are 1,200 widows. So it was a real bloodbath, a charnel house, a civil war in South Carolina, but it helped make American independence possible.
Yep.
Wonderful.
Alan Pell Crawford, the author of This Fierce People, The Untold Story of America's Revolutionary War in the South. It has been a pleasure having you today on The Journal. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. I know that I did. In This Fierce People, Alan Pell Crawford tells the story of 3+ years in the American Revolution and of the battles fought in the South that made up the central theater of military operations in the latter years of the Revolutionary War, upending the national narrative that America's victory over the British lay solely with General George Washington and his troops.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
New episodes of Walter Edgar's Journal are published on the first and third Fridays of the month, and are available at southcarolinapublicradio.org, on the SCETV app, and from your favorite podcast provider. We'll talk again soon.